Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close Up, the Colorado Supreme Court pulls Donald Trump's name off the ballot there. What his opponents for the Republican nominations say about the ruling. Polls show Trump leads those opponents here in Iowa. The caucus expectations that could turn second place into a win. And the Iowa legislature gavels in 1 week before the Iowa caucuses. What Republicans and Democrats hope to achieve this session.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning and welcome to Close Up. I'm Laura Terrell in for Amanda Rooker. A bombshell decision by the Colorado Supreme Court is having repercussions on the presidential campaigns here in Iowa. In a 4-3 decision, Colorado justices ruled Donald Trump could not appear on that state's ballot. They cited Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment. That section prohibits anyone who swore an oath to support the Constitution and then engage in an insurrection from holding office. The Colorado High Court said they did not reach this decision lightly. And one of the groups that brought the lawsuit said they aren't pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. They say the lawsuit is about holding office holders accountable.
Look, we're not in it to help a candidate or hurt a candidate. We're in it to ensure that the rules set out in the Constitution, which are there to protect the democracy from those who have attacked it in the past, those who put our whole democratic system at risk, to make sure that those people are not put back in a position to do that same kind of thing again. This is not about whether a Democrat or a Republican wins. Any candidate who has not engaged in insurrection after swearing an oath to support the Constitution should be able to be on the ballot. But the rules are in there for a reason. They're clear and they need to be enforced.
As you would expect, the Trump campaign quickly condemned the Colorado Supreme Court ruling. In a statement released last week, Trump's campaign said the case was supported by a Soros-funded left-wing group's scheme to interfere in an election. And that ruling eliminates the rights of Colorado voters to vote for the candidate of their choice. The Trump campaign says it would swiftly file an appeal with the United States Supreme Court and that they expect the High Court to rule in their favor. Several of Trump's rivals were in Iowa campaigning when the ruling came down, each saying that the voters should decide which candidate wins, not the courts.
And you see that with the Colorado Supreme Court. I mean, look, if somebody's convicted or something of some of these things, there was no trial on any of this. They basically just said, what, you can't be on the ballot? I mean, how does that work? What's the limiting principle for that? Why could we just say that Biden can't be on the ballot because he let in 8 million illegals into the country and violated the Constitution, which he has? Could we just say, oh, well, they have money coming to Hunter, whatever? So I think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to reverse that.
Colorado, I will tell you that I don't think Donald Trump needs to be president. I think I need to be president. I think that's good for the country. But I will beat him fair and square. We don't need to have judges making these decisions. We need voters to make these decisions. So I want to see this in the hands of the voters. We're going to win this the right way. We're going to do what we need to do. But the last thing we want is judges telling us who can and can't be on the ballot.
I think that strikes me as the wrong decision, and it's appalling for the future of our country. We're not a country where we want the federal police state to decide who is or isn't running, and we don't want it to be decided by a small group of people behind the back of palace walls. It should be decided by the people of this country. And to tell you the truth, it'd be a lot easier for me to get elected if Trump wasn't in this race, but it's not about me and it's not about another candidate. This is wrong, and I think that this is a flagrant violation of the rule of law. I don't think that draining from the people of this country the ability to stand for the democratic will of the people, that's not America.
Vivek Ramaswamy says he will withdraw from the Colorado Republican primary if that state's Supreme Court's decision to keep Trump off the ballot stands. He also called on the other Republican candidates to do the same. Republican candidate Ryan Binkley says he is fighting his own battle to get on the ballot in Minnesota. In a statement, Binkley says keeping legitimate candidates off the ballot silences the voices of many Americans, which is an attack on the heart of the nation's democracy. Binkley adds that even if we were convinced Trump committed insurrection, there must be due process before a candidate can be disqualified. Chris Christie, who has been campaigning for the Republican nomination in New Hampshire, has been a very vocal critic of Trump. He said Trump should be prevented from being president again by the people, not by the court.
I do not believe Donald Trump should be prevented from being president of the United States by any court. I think he should be prevented from being president of the United States by the voters of this country. I think this is probably premature and jumping ahead of it, and I think it would cause a lot of anger in this country if people had the choice taken away from them.
Asa Hutchinson has also been a critic of Trump, particularly about his actions on January 6th. In a statement, Hutchinson says he's stated all along Trump's actions should disqualify him from holding public office ever again. He also calls on the Republican Party to move on from Trump. President Joe Biden was asked last week about the Colorado ruling during his visit to Milwaukee. Biden said there isn't any doubt Trump supported an insurrection.
Well, I think certainly it's self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything.
So here's what we'll be watching for in this case in the weeks to come. The Colorado Supreme Court stayed their ruling until January 4th. That's the day before the Colorado Secretary of State must certify its ballots for the state's March 5th primary. If the U.S. Supreme Court agrees to take up Trump's appeal before that date, Trump's name would likely still appear on Colorado's primary ballot. But this is just one challenge to Trump's eligibility to be on the ballot. According to legal tracking website Lawfare, 13 other state courts are looking over similar legal challenges. Challenges that were dismissed in Arizona and Michigan are being appealed. The Colorado Republican Party said on social media if Trump was not allowed on the primary ballot, it would switch to a caucus to get around the ruling. Next on Close Up, caucus expectations. Why KCCI's political analyst says coming in first may not be the most important thing. The Iowa legislature starts its next session 1 week before the caucuses. What Republican and Democratic leaders have on their agendas. Recent polls show there has been some movement in the Republican presidential race, but mainly for the frontrunner Donald Trump. According to the most recent Des Moines Register NBC News Mediacom Iowa poll, Trump's support among likely caucus goers is now at 51%, up from 43% in October. Ron DeSantis slightly pulled ahead of Nikki Haley. None of the other candidates received double-digit support. But the candidate who wins the caucus might not be the candidate that comes in first. KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford says momentum coming out of Iowa will go to candidates that meet or beat expectations.
I think what the Iowa poll does is show the solidified position of former President Trump. He's got a core base here in Iowa and around the country that will be with him until the end of the solar system, if not the universe. They're never going to leave him. That's what's complicated running against him on the part of, say, Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis and the others who've left the race. Because in order to run against him, they've got to say why they're better than he is. But at the same time, they can't risk alienating that core Trump base. And with somebody with a 51% polling status at this particular point, a month before the caucuses, a lot can happen in a week in politics, but that's a pretty solid position to be in. Endorsements really don't matter much for well-known candidates. If there's somebody running an election and you have no idea who that is, but somebody you know in a position of authority you respect recommends that person, that's where an endorsement might make a difference. But when you talk about fairly well-known candidates who are advertising for themselves, endorsements don't make a huge difference. Now, in a close race, anything at the margins can swing a race one way or the other. But at this point, it's not close. Now, we can't say that it won't get closer as we near January 15th, but we have to remember that the Iowa caucuses are not about vote totals or percentages per se. They're about expectations. And the central question will be for any and all candidates, however big the lead or however far behind someone is, did you do better than expected or did you do worse than expected? So it's all about an expectations scenario. I mean, on the one hand, the caucus campaigns have been a race for second place. But at the same time, we have to remember second place is second place. And until the former president starts to betray certain weaknesses or a possible alternative candidate, whoever is in second place, starts to show some unanticipated strengths, it's been a pretty dull campaign this caucus season. I've seen a lot of caucus campaigns on both sides, Democratic as well as and Republican too. And this is, in a way, seems to be the slowest, dullest caucus season that I've seen in a long time. To a great extent, that's because the dynamics of the race seem to have been frozen and they're not moving so far. The question over the last month is, will those dynamics change? Will that logjam start to break up? In a sense, as an incumbent, he's the standard bearer. 40% of Republicans believe, if not more, that he really didn't lose the last election, so they see him as their incumbent candidate, if not incumbent president. And absent some major problem, and of course the question is whether these lawsuits and legal proceedings are going to constitute that, it's hard to take on an incumbent. But I think that the key question is, will Trump show any unexpected weakness in the caucuses? He doesn't have to lose them. But if the second place finisher finishes a lot closer than expected, if Trump finishes with a much lower percentage of that caucus preference vote than expected, then maybe there's a little bit of a dynamic starting to occur, and the question would be what happens in New Hampshire. But otherwise, if the lay of the land as it is now is what we're looking at the morning of January 16th, then it's hard to see how there's room for the other alternative candidates to really make a serious dent in that Trump support. It betrays a certain weakness. I mean, the concern on the part of a lot of Republicans, although recently they've got more confidence, but the concern on the part of a lot of Republicans 6 months or so ago was the view as expressed by one Republican that the only Republican who could not beat Joe Biden is Donald Trump. That was a concern expressed by a Republican a half a dozen months or so ago. Republicans certainly here in Iowa have more confidence that he's able to beat Biden. Biden has some serious weaknesses. So again, the question is, are they going to stay coalesced around Trump? Or will the caucuses suggest that there is some doubt on the part of Republicans that might provide an opening for an alternative candidate? And at this point, we just don't know that. I mean, things can happen in other primaries, and there's another calendar that's operating besides the primary calendar, and that's the legal proceeding calendar. Now, a lot of Republicans think all this is political persecution. Others think, well, no, he might have done these things, but they're not as serious as some folks are making them out to be. There are a lot of unknowns out there. So there are a lot of dynamics, legal as well as political, operating out there, independently of the primary calendar. And the question is, down the road, will those other factors come into play, or will Donald Trump continue to hold that solid core of support he's had and succeed to the nomination? The concern for the alternative candidates like Haley and DeSantis at this point is that while they know they can't win with that Trump support only, their problem is they can't win without that Trump support. And a lot of that Trump base really are Trump supporters before they're Republicans. And the concern of any other possible Republican nominee is that if he didn't get the nomination, they may just take their ball and go home and not show up. Yes, he's got to win big. This is why I think there's some recent campaign ads on behalf of Trump when he talks about needing to win big, got to have big numbers. He wants to stamp out and crush those alternatives as quickly as possible.
Next on Close Up, we are just 15 days away from the start of the 2024 Iowa legislative session, what Republicans and Democrats say they'll push for at the State House. And next month marks the end of Frank Cownie's 20 years as mayor of Des Moines. Hear what he says about his next role with the city. The Iowa Legislature's 2024 session starts January 8th, just 15 days from now. And we recently spoke with Republican Speaker of the House, Pat Grassley, and Democratic House Minority Leader Jennifer Confirst about their party's plans.
And this year we tried to lay out a handful of themes in which we want to be some of the driving issues that we look at this session. And I think you're going to really see a focus on, and I can go into more detail, but see a focus on continuing to look at our standards within education and our curriculum within education. I think that's a key conversation that we need to have to make sure we're having the outcomes we expect from our students. And we really want to engage with administrators, teachers, parents to make sure that we're fulfilling the needs. Within that, I think there's one thing we'd really like to take a look at that's come from our caucus feedback is looking at history, civics more as part of what the curriculum may look like. One of the other topics that I think we're going to see us talking about is going to be public safety issues. And I mean that from the standpoint of making sure that we have a safe Iowa. We're hearing more and more from businesses across the state about retail theft and other things that are starting to be more issues that we didn't realize were maybe as big as they are, but as we've been talking about them, more and more groups have been reaching out that they want to be a part of those conversations, as well as keeping violent offenders out of our communities. I think Iowans have an expectation to feel safe where they live. That's part of why you live in Iowa. Leave your car unlocked while you're running the grocery store, be able to leave it parked in the driveway overnight. So I think you're going to see some focus on some of those policies. Tax policy is obviously continues to be one that as Iowans face inflationary pressures, we want to get the money back in their hands as quickly as possible. We're in a position to do that with the way we've budgeted and the revenues that we've had in the state. So I think you're going to see that part of the conversation. We also want to make sure that we're actively seeking businesses from other states that maybe don't like the business climate they have, the tax climate that they have, and working to get them here. And lastly, really looking at making sure that our government is operating in an efficient and a transparent manner. One of the ideas, and I touched on this, but I think it's going to be an interesting concept, and came from a few of our members working together, is looking at history and civics and having more of that conversation. Also making sure that we're supporting our educators. We're hearing more and more that educators are spending way too little time educating because of all the other demands on their time within the classroom. And so that's just one example of something that's come from our conversations by putting some of these topics out there. And ideally, we want to talk about not only K-12 education, but I think we're also going to talk about higher education as well. Last session, we started down the path of really looking at how we fund higher education and making sure that we're fulfilling our high demand fields that we have, that we're getting a value as a taxpayer out of our regions and higher education institutions.
Priorities continue to be how we're going to put people over politics. So we're going to protect and defend public education and fully fund public education, which means we support underfunding and not funding school vouchers. We want to defend reproductive freedom. We want to legalize marijuana for adult use, and we want to lower costs for Iowa families. And that last plank, the lowering costs for Iowa families of our People Over Politics initiative, is what we're going to focus on this session. We have more legislation to put forward to address housing, childcare, and other costs that are facing families every day. So we have legislation already that's been filed and ready to go. One that is a constitutional amendment that would enshrine the right to an abortion in Iowa's Constitution. We also have one that would expand postpartum coverage for Medicaid moms to 12 months, and then we have one for over-the-counter birth control as well. So we continue to do whatever we can to defend reproductive freedom in the state because we know Iowa women are with us and Iowans are with us.
Okay. And day one, January 8th, what are House Democrats, what can we expect y'all to do?
The first week, we're going to be announcing several pieces of legislation designed to lower costs for Iowans. That includes ways to be more creative about housing options so that we can expand housing. There's a 25,000 unit shortage of housing in the state by the time we get to 2030. So we have to get to work on making housing more accessible and available to Iowans. We also have several proposals that will address childcare costs, will help with wages of childcare workers, and several other pieces of legislation that are designed, all of them, to put people first and to lower costs for everyday Iowa families.
And Democrats will likely have a tough time pushing their agenda through the legislature this session. Republicans hold more than double the number of seats in the Iowa Senate as Democrats. The GOP controls the Iowa House by almost the same margin. Next on Close Up, Frank Cownie's time as Des Moines mayor is ending. We ask him about his new job with the city. The city of Des Moines is closing in on the end of an era. Next month, Frank Cownie will end his 20-plus years in city politics, first as an at-large city councilman, then for the last 2 decades as the mayor. Cownie decided not to run for an unprecedented 6th term. He will be replaced by Connie Boesen, who won the November election. On Wednesday, the city held a reception to honor Cownie. KCCI asked him about his next job as the city's new climate ambassador.
I still serve as the global president of ICLEI, which is the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives, which now is called Cities for Sustainability. And so I am going to be that for the rest of this year, and then they want me to be on the executive committee of that for the next 3 years after that. So I'm going to stay engaged, and hopefully we can keep the city engaged. We've got our new climate action plan here in Des Moines, the ADAPT DSM that we've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years, and then kind of as a new chapter, because remembering, over 10 years before that, we were what we called a star community, and we were one of the first 6 or 7 that worked with the United States Green Building Council and ICLEI to create the Sustainable City, Resilient Cities trademark. And so this is sort of a new chapter moving us forward and showing how we can plan and work together with our citizens and our businesses. And I'm proud to be part of that and look forward to moving that forward, knowing that all the time stuff changes. Technology changes, circumstance changes, and of course, unfortunately, the climate keeps changing too.
Cownie also got a surprise honor from the city. The former Nationwide building on Locust Street will be renamed the TM Franklin County City Administration Building. The building will be used for city offices in the future. Well, thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We will see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.